Okay. Okay, before we start, we have a couple of dedications here. The first one is tonight is a yahrzeit of Rabbi Shalom Brot. Rabbi Shalom Brot is the one who began Yeshivat Simchat Shlomo 25, 30 years ago, right after Reb Shlomo passed away. He began a yeshiva in Reb Shlomo's name, Yeshivat Simchat Shlomo. It's in Nachalot in Yerushalayim. And this is his yahrzeit. His name is Harav Shalom ben Yosef Yekutiel Zusha. And I had the great merit to teach it at the yeshiva off and on over many years. And Rabbi Brot and I ran 3 10-week leadership training courses that we developed together. They were really, really, really very good. And not that long after the last one, he passed away. And he's remembered very, very fondly by many, many people. So again, Harav Shalom ben Yosef Yekutiel Zusha. Also, it's a yahrzeit of a good friend of mine in Tzfat, Yisrael Sandler. It's his father's yahrzeit. His father's name is Avram ben Chaim. So both of them should have an aliyat neshama. Robert wants to make a dedication, so I have to, we'll make it quick. So we're going to have to unmute, and then unmute again. Okay, Robert, if you want to say something.
Yeah, I have lurking Charles. They're problem with the breed is that they all have weak hearts. They're all heart. And Annie, who was really sweet, passed away Sunday. Her last full day before was Shabbos. It was a great Shabbos. The entire family came over. She had all the kids to play with. The next day, my daughter brought the kids and some more cousins on a pool hopping trip with a pizza party afterwards, ending up here. And she had more kids to play with if she could choose how to go out. That's where she wanted to go, but it's not easy being without her.
Make deep connections there.
I remember something the Rebbe said that is very appropriate. A Caliph is short for Kolev, all heart.
Yeah, all heart.
And he was a Caliph.
Okay. May you find another heartful companion at the right time. Okay. Okay, here we go. Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. We are continuing our series on Ma'aseh Merkavah, the workings of the Chariot. last week, in a certain way, we completed looking at the first 11 chapters of the book of Ezekiel. Most of that time was spent on the first chapter, which is the essence of what is called Maaseh Merkavah. But we found that in chapters 2 through 11, it really, really helps us see a bigger picture in the context in which Ezekiel is having his vision. This week, we're going to start with one of the most important elements of those last few chapters of 10 and 11. And hopefully we're going to see that what we're going to learn tonight is, in a certain way, putting the whole picture together. And this only came through my research. I didn't expect to come to certain conclusions. But when I studied these last chapters and put a lot of thought into what they're telling us, so the secret here is that in these chapters, a new type of angel is introduced, the Kruvim, singular Keruv. And we're going to learn about these kind of angels and why it's so important they're being introduced pretty much at this late stage of his vision. They're not mentioned at all in the first chapter, where many people just stop at the first chapter and don't go on and see a bigger context. And even in chapters 2 through 9, they're not mentioned. All of a sudden, the Kruvim takes center fold. And we're going to try to understand that and what it's teaching us about Maaseh Merkavah. So first of all, we have to look, where else are these type of angels mentioned in the Torah, in the Tanakh? Because only that way are we going to understand their introduction into his vision at this point, what it's telling us. So we have to go back all the ways to the Garden of Eden. And the first time that the Kruvim are mentioned, really in the 5 books of Moses in the Chumash, they're really only mentioned 3 times, these Kruvim. And the first one is in the 3rd chapter, the 23rd and 24th verses. And this is after Adam and Chava have eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They've been expelled from the garden. And then it says, Vayashlichehu Hashem Elokim migan Eden. God sent them, meaning Adam and Chava, out of the Garden of Eden, la'avod et adama, to work the ground, asher lekach misham, that they were taken from the earth. In a previous chapter, it says, man was created from the dust of the earth, and God blew into this physicality a soul of life. And then it says, Vayigaresh et Adam, vayashkein mikedem legan Eden. And he expelled Adam, and he dwelt east of the Garden of Eden. Et hakruvim v'et lat hacherev hamitapechet lishmor et derech eitz chaim. And it's interesting. It's interesting because the verb, even though in English it has the verb that he placed these kruvim, these angels, in the Hebrew it actually doesn't have that verb. I only noticed that right now. Nonetheless, he placed these angels with a fiery sword that rotated, a rotating sword to guard the way of the tree of life. Now, it's a very enigmatic concept here that God put these kruvim with a fiery rotating sword to guard the way to the tree of life. So the simple understanding is, what are the kruvim doing there? And I have to point out, and this is critical to our understanding tonight, is Rashi says they were destructive angels. That's all he says. They were destructive angels. And the simple understanding is that when God expelled Adam and Chava, he already said, we have to expel them from the Garden of Eden, lest they come and they eat from the tree of life and live forever. So he expelled him, and the simple thing is, he put these angels there to block, to prevent Adam and Chava from returning to the garden. That is the literal understanding. But because of the way that the verse is written in Hebrew, there's a second possible understanding, that even though Adam and Chava were expelled, and God wanted to make sure that at least this point, they did not eat from the tree of life because they had disobeyed God and they didn't deserve to eat from the tree of life at this point. So these angels are there to protect the Garden of Eden from human beings returning. And yet the secondary meaning can be that they're there to remind us that there is a Garden of Eden and that we do eventually have to return to there. And that's why it says that they're there to guard the way to the tree of life. Now, both of these are true simultaneously. And this will help us understand everything else we're going to learn tonight, that they had a dual purpose: to prevent, but to also show the way back to the Garden of Eden. So that is the first mention of these kruvim. The next is in the book of Exodus, where they come on the scene again in a very, very important place. In 25:18 of Exodus, so God is giving instructions for making the holy ark for the tabernacle. And on the ark was a cover. Inside the ark were the two tablets of the law, the original Torah that Moshe wrote. And then it says, V'yasita shnayim kruvim zahav. You shall make two kruvim, two images of these types of angels. Mikshe ta'aseh otam. They have to be out of one block of gold. Mishnei kitzot hakaporet, from the two sides of the covering of the ark. And it continues. Yasita kuruv echad mikatzeh mizeh, ukruv echad mikatzeh mizeh. Mina kaporet ta'asu et kruvim al shnei kitzotav. Put one keruv on one side of the covering, the other one on the other side of the covering. V'hayu hakruvim porsei kanafayim lamala, sochachim b'kanfehem ala kaporet upneim ish el achiv ela kaporet yu pnei hakruvim. And then it says that the kruvim should be spreading their wings above, and this is actually sochachim is the root of the word schach. Schach is the covering of the sukkah, the greenery that we put at the top of the sukkah, and it's considered the essence of the sukkah is the covering, is the schach. So these wings were hovering over the Holy Ark. And their faces were one to the other. And they were also looking slightly down towards to the top of the covering, which was covering the ark. So that is the whole explanation. Now, these kruvim obviously have a very, very important function here. This is the holy ark inside of the Holy of Holies, holding the two tablets of the law. The entire encampment in the desert surrounded the Mishkan. And the central place in the Mishkan is the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies has this holy ark with these two kruvim with their wings spread over it. So, of course, there's much discussion over the millennium about these two kruvim. But first of all, we have to mention that the Torah itself is called a tree of life. We say it every time we put the Torah back in the ark after a public reading. Eitz chaim hi l'macha zikim ba. The Torah is a tree of life for those who hold on to it. And so the ark itself, which is housing the Torah, is representing the tree of life. So just like in the Garden of Eden, there were two kruvim put there to do two things, to prevent, but also to show the way back. And now, all of a sudden, these kruvim appear again, hovering over the Torah, which is called a tree of life. So the imagery here is that the Torah is the way to return to the Garden of Eden. Many, many people refer Shabbat to the Garden of Eden. The experience of Shabbat is like returning to the Garden of Eden. And we're told that in the Messianic times, that Israel will be again like a Garden of Eden. And the world to come will be like a Garden of Eden. So now we see these kruvim in probably the most central place of all Judaism, in the Holy of Holies above the ark. And since the Torah represents the tree of life, so we're told that the two kruvim, and there are many explanations, but we're told that it represents a male and female figure, and that represents Israel and God. That is the whole story of Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, is about this relationship between God and Israel, a love relationship, a passionate, intimate love relationship. And that's what the kruvim represent, the relationship between God and Israel. There is a tradition written in the Talmud that when God and Israel were on, we'll call it good terms. Israel was following the Torah. They were listening to God. They were establishing a righteous society. So then the two Kruvim would be facing each other. But then, we'll call it miraculously, when Israel was not doing the will of God, when they were running after idols and had forgotten all about the Torah, it was said that if anyone would go into the Holy of Holies, the two Kruvim were back to back. They actually turned on the covering and were back to back. And so again, here we have a dual aspect to the Kruvim. They could represent the passionate, intimate love relationship between God and Israel, or they could symbolize the terrible gulf, the distance that Israel had made between itself and God. One other explanation is that these two Kruvim represent the chesed and the gevura of God, along with the idea of Israel and God, but as another level of understanding, they represent the chesed and the gevura of God. And that we can see already, because in Gan Eden, the Kruvim were functioning on two different levels. They represented the judgment of God, that Adam and Eve had to leave the Garden of Eden. At the same time, they represent God's chesed, that he wants us to be able to come back to the Garden of Eden. And the same thing with our relationship. Sometimes the relationship goes into gevura mode, into judgment mode. And sometimes it's in chesed, loving kindness mode. So here we see over and over again, there's a dual aspect to these Kruvim. Now, what's interesting is in the book of Chronicles, at one point, the ark itself is called the Merkavah. This is very, very significant. This is in the first book of Chronicles, the 28th chapter. And it says that, in the 18th verse, it says, and it's talking about gold for different parts of the Mishkan, gold and silver. And here it says, and for the altar of incense, refined gold, and gold for the pattern of the chariot that is the Kruvim, that spread out their wings and cover the ark of the covenant. So this is very unique, that here the ark is being referred to as the Merkavah itself, the chariot of God. And who is on the chariot? The Kruvim. So that is a very, very significant of time together. The Holy of Holies, the ark, with the whole vision of the Merkavah and the Kruvim. And now I want to also read a series from Tehillim, where God, and we see it in the 10th and 11th chapter, that just like in the first chapter, when it moved into an understanding that we're talking about a chariot here, it said that on the Chariot, there was a throne. And on the throne, Ezekiel sees a figure of a man, but this man really is the figure of God. And he's riding on the Chariot. So in the 11th chapter, it says it a number of times, the 10th and 11th chapters, a number of times where Ezekiel now understands that his original understanding and vision of the Chayot, they were actually kruvim. And it says it explicitly, that, and even says that going back to his vision at the river, that what he understood were the Chayot, he now understands were the kruvim. And so then later he explains how God is riding on the Chayot, the kruvim aren't mentioned. But here in Tehillim 99, it begins by saying, Hashem Malach, Yegezu Amim, Yoshev Kruvim Tanuta Ors. It says, God reigns, is sovereign. Let the people have awe of God. He is enthroned upon the Kruvim. Let the earth be moved. Another, he is, as it were, riding on these Kruvim. That is the 99th. In the 80th Psalm, it says, similar. It says, like this, give ear, O shepherd of Israel, that leadest Joseph like a flock. You, speaking about God, you who are enthroned upon the Kruvim, shine forth. So in Hebrew, Hazina Noheg Ketson Yosef, Yoshev HaKruvim, Hofia, appear. So again, God is envisioned as riding on the Kruvim. There's one more that is very important, and we're going to revisit this verse in a coming class. So here it's the 68th Psalm, the 18th verse, and it says, Rechev Elokim Rabotayim Alfei Shanan Hashem Bam Sinai Bakodesh. So here, it doesn't mention the Kruvim, but it mentions that God is riding on a chariot. And it says, the chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands of angels. God is among them. He is at Sinai in holiness. He's at Mount Sinai in holiness. We're going to revisit this. But here, and there are a number of other ones that don't mention the Kruvim, but mention God riding on a chariot. Now, one more very, very important mention of the Kruvim is that when they made the curtains around the tabernacle, around where the holy place was, the sanctuary was, where the Holy of Holies was, and the menorah, and the showbread, and the incense, there were curtains all around. So in the 26th chapter, the first verse, it says, the Eta Mishkan Ta'aseh Eser Yeriot, and for the Mishkan make 10 curtains. Shesh Mashzar V'Techelet Yargaman V'Tolat Shani. Excuse me. Twisted linen with turquoise, purple, and scarlet wool. Ma'aseh Choshev, a woven design. Kruvim Ma'aseh Choshev Ta'aseh Otam. in other words, in the woven design, make designs of kruvim in the curtains. And so Rashi says, one second, I have to find this Rashi. One second. Okay, I can't find it to read it to you on the inside, but what he says is that it was there were two layers for these curtains, and on either side there would be pictures of the kruvim woven in. But then he says an incredibly important thing that, again, we're going to revisit. It says that along with the kruvim, there were also images of lions and eagles. Now, that brings us back to Ezekiel's vision, that he saw the Chariot, and then in chapter 10 and 11, the Chariot become kruvim, and they also have four faces. And of the four faces is the original one was an ox, a man, a lion, and an eagle. We discussed this at great length. Here, though, and we mentioned this already, the ox is replaced with a keruv. So now it was a keruv, a man, a lion, and an eagle. And so we already discussed how did that happen? How did the ox be exchanged for this keruv, this angel? We said that Ezekiel prayed for this because the ox represented the golden calf. And Ezekiel prayed that this image could be removed from the chariot, and it would be replaced by a keruv. And that's what it was. But here, this Rashi, and again, we're going to revisit this, it is so significant because this is the making of the Mishkan is approximately 800 years before Ezekiel's vision. And this is something that we've said repeatedly, and the upcoming classes, we're going to go into great depth to show that the antecedents for the Maaseh Merkavah, and this is one of them here already in the Mishkan, were these curtains that had the images that would later be seen by Ezekiel in his vision. So in other words, the concept, the tradition, the mystical tradition of what we call Maaseh Merkavah was already in existence. And that we will return to understand. So now I want to get to the main point here. The main point is, what do we learn from this? What do we learn that all of a sudden this class of angels are introduced into still part of the vision of Ezekiel? And that's what we said, that most people just concentrate on chapter 1, and they don't realize that in chapter 3, 8, and then 11, 10 and 11, Ezekiel goes back into the vision and describes it. But now he's describing how the kruvim, in a certain way, have taken over the main symbolism within the vision. So when I was doing all this research, I have to say, what I'm about to say came to me really as like an epiphany, because here we've been learning about Maaseh Merkavah for a couple months now. And our understanding has been building. And only when I came upon the Kruvim and what I'm going to say now, did all the pieces start to come together. So let's try to understand this. Why the Kruvim at this point, and what is it teaching us? So here we've made a point that the Kruvim in the Garden of Eden had a dual purpose. The Kruvim on the ark, sometimes they were turned one to the other, sometimes they turned back to back. In the curtains, on one side are the Kruvim, on the other side are lions and eagles. But the main thing is this idea of there seems to be a dual energy, purpose to these angels. Now, these angels, of course, are messengers of God. They are not independent agents here. And so here, we're going to go back to a theme that we've been following, but this strengthens it tremendously. When we went back to literally the first few verses, we saw that when the vision began, he saw a storm wind, and there was a dark cloud, and then a fire, and then a noga, a surrounding aura, and then the chashmal. There are really 5 different elements. And we explained it in 2 different ways. And in a certain way, 2 opposite ways. One explanation is all of these symbols, the dark cloud and the fire and the surrounding aura and the chashmal. And remember, we spent perhaps 2 weeks just on the word chashmal and the essence of paradox that the chashmal represents, silence and speech, but that represents all paradox. And so many of the commentaries say what he was being shown was the upcoming destruction of the temple. The first thing Ezekiel says is, I was among the exiles. And as we've learned, he was exiled before the destruction of the temple. Nebuchadnezzar was already ruling in Jerusalem. 10 years later, the temple was destroyed. Ezekiel begins his vision partway through that 10-year exile. And so all of those elements that he was seeing was a pre-vision of what was about to happen. Now, Ezekiel God had not spelled it out completely for him, even though Jeremiah was still in Israel and he had been prophesying for years that Israel has to change their ways or the temple will be destroyed. And so the prophecy was in the air that if the people don't change their ways, the temple would be destroyed. And maybe they would. It wasn't written in stone yet. The other way we described these 5 elements was from Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. And he explained it that these were 5 different impediments to getting into a deep meditation. That each one represented a sort of emotional, brain activity, mental, intellectual obstacles to get into a deep meditative state. And this certainly is the essence of Maaseh Merkavah. And we will develop this even further. We have said this all along, that Maaseh Merkavah is way beyond whatever symbolism that we can understand from Ezekiel or Isaiah or Zechariah, that Maseh Merkavah is an individual experience of one who is involved in this kind of deep mystical meditation. So that's how Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan explained it. And then through almost all of chapter 1, we explored deeply the different symbols and what it tells us about the fabric of the universe, what it tells us about the mechanisms of how nature works, how the spiritual worlds work. We introduced some very deep concepts of quantum physics and physics that are alluded to in this vision. And then at the end of chapter 1, Ezekiel is seeing the full glory of God. He falls on his face, and then God begins to speak to him. But from that's the end of chapter 1. But from chapters 2 through 11, it's almost all about the upcoming destruction of the temple. And even when Yechezkel goes back into the symbolism, the elements, the images of the vision in the chapters 3, 8, 10, 11, he goes back into them, but now they have a very different context. And God, throughout these chapters, is telling him the destruction is coming. You have to warn the people. They still had a chance to save themselves, but they didn't. They didn't change their ways. And so here, putting this together, and that's what the Kruvim represent here. There's two levels of understanding this whole vision here, and they're both true simultaneously, and that's what paradox is. And that's what we said, that one of the explanations of the two Kruvim on the ark was God's Gevura and God's Chesed. And we've said from the beginning, the whole idea of the Chashmal, this is the only place in the Tanakh that the concept of Chashmal, of paradox, is mentioned, the essence of paradox. And I remember in the beginning, we also asked the question, if the destruction is coming, and we had a general principle that prophecy does not happen outside of Israel. So why was Ezekiel being granted this really awesome vision? And there we answered, and we're repeating it again here, is that even with the destruction coming, God wanted Ezekiel to know, and through Ezekiel, all of Israel to this day to know that even in destruction, even in exile, God will never divorce the Jewish people, will never allow them to be destroyed, and will never break his covenant with the Jewish people. And so he's been granted in Chesed this vision, and you can read as totally hopeful. God is revealing to Ezekiel the secrets of the universe in what's called Maseh Merkavah, and even shows himself, and Ezekiel can at least taste a bit of the glory of God. And yet that is in the context of this greater destruction that's about to happen. In the Gemara, they share seemingly a very strange thing. And it says that when the Romans, Second Temple, when the Romans came into, I need to check this, whether it was the First Temple or the Second Temple. I'm being honest here. When either the Babylonians or the Romans came in to the Holy of Holies, they had destroyed the temple. hundreds of thousands of Jews were dead in Yerushalayim. They said the streets flowed with rivers of blood. When they came into the Holy of Holies, they saw the Kruvim in a love embrace. So we would ask, how could that be? Can you imagine a time that Israel and God were further apart as God is allowing the temple to be destroyed because of Israel's actions? So you would expect the Kruvim would be back to back. They were in a love embrace. So this is paradox, Sheba paradox. But it's that teaching is there for a reason. And it's the same thing on Tisha B'Av. On Tisha B'Av is the lowest point of the year. We memorialize, we acknowledge, we remember all of the tragedies of Jewish history. We sit on the floor, we fast with these candles, and yet we're told Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av. So again, you would say, like, how can you put the two together? But that's the exact point. That is the exact point, that at the lowest point, God will always send the salvation, will always send the consolation. So I want to read again from chapter 11. And this is after God has shown Ezekiel. If you remember, he literally took him up by his hair and he transported him in a vision to Jerusalem, and he showed him the destruction. And if you remember, Ezekiel cried out, God, are you going to allow the whole people to be slain? Now we have to understand this was all in a vision. Only, I think it was 6 years later was the temple actually destroyed. But he saw God was granting him a vision with the hope that somehow this warning could get through to the people and they would change their ways. Nonetheless, we know that they didn't. But at the end of chapter 11, after Ezekiel is like, he's in shock at what he's being shown. And it's difficult for him. He's having a hard time integrating this. And so one of the most beautiful prophecies of all the prophets happens right now. So God turns to him and says, he says, I'll read the whole thing. It's worth reading again. Thus says God, although I have cast them far off among the nations, and although I have scattered them among the countries, and I have been to them a little sanctuary in the countries where they have come, meaning God is saying, even in exile, I will be a small sanctuary for you, meaning I will be among you. I will be among you. And then if we look at Jewish history, actually, if you look at world history, and we see the contributions that Jews have made to human development while we were in exile, it is astounding. Only when a true history of the world is written will people understand and acknowledge the contribution that the Jewish people made while in exile, while experiencing oppression, while being second, third, or fourth standard citizens, if that, and all of the oppression and crusades and expulsions and you name it, what we were able to accomplish. So God says, I will be a small sanctuary for you. But he goes on, therefore say, Therefore say, thus says God. In other words, Ezekiel is supposed to say this to the people. Yet will I gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered. And I will give you the land of Israel, and they shall come there, and they shall take away all the detestable things and all the abominations, and I will give them one heart, and I will put a new spirit within you, and I will take the stony heart out of their flesh, and I will give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my ordinances and do them. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. So this is right after God is showing him the terrible destruction that is about to happen. So here, this is the importance of the Kruvim being introduced at this part of the vision. Because the Kruvim represent these two sides, Chesed and Gevurah. As we know, it says, Yasai Elokim, Zelumat Zeh Asa Elokim. This against this God has made. Everything is opposite. Everything is balanced. We have a Yetzer HaTov and a Yetzer Hara. And in fact, this whole idea of Maaseh Merkavah, as I just mentioned, is a very personal, individual type of vision. Isaiah explained it his way. Ezekiel explained it his way. Zechariah explained it his way. Daniel explained it his way. But as we're going to see in upcoming classes, the concept of mystical meditation leading us to deep and profound levels of consciousness preceded these descriptions of Maaseh Merkavah by thousands of years. It has been part and parcel of Judaism from its very inception. But within a person, we have this duality. We have a Yetzer HaTov and a Yetzer Hara. We lean towards Chesed, we lean towards Gevurah. We are full, the human being is full of paradoxes. We have emotions that swing back and forth. We have intellectual reasonings that go back and forth. And this is Maaseh Merkavah. These are the Kruvim that are now representing a deeper understanding of this whole vision. This whole vision is much more than one description can give it. It is both God's chesed and God's gevurah. It is both judgment and loving kindness. It is the material physical world and the spiritual world. And everything that we've learned in a certain way, I'm just expressing for myself, I came to understand really for the first time the deeper, bigger picture of what Maaseh Merkavah is. It's the essence of opposites. It's the essence of putting opposites together to make a unity. It is the essence of paradox. And again, that's why the Kruvim are introduced here. The Chashmal is mentioned, it's only mentioned 3 times, but it's mentioned again in these later chapters. And that's why, and again, we're going to get into this in coming weeks, the Mishnah in Chagiga said you can, a Rebbe, an accomplished teacher can only give over Maaseh Merkavah to one person at a time, and that person has to be on a very high level. Because what we're talking about here is being introduced to paradox. So you can imagine what Ezekiel is experiencing here. On one hand, he's being shown the glory of God. he's being shown angelic figures. He's seeing the unity between physical and spiritual, between soul and body, the unity of the fabric of the universe. And he's also seeing like paradox at its epitome, the way it gets played out in our lives. And so that's why this tradition of Maaseh Merkavah was so guarded. This is not just a simple meditation. This is getting into the core paradoxes of life. And that's why, as a teaser for next week, we are going to explain one of the most famous stories in the entire Talmud is Arba Shenichnasu lePardes, the four that went into paradise. And the reason that we're going to go into that before we're going to go kind of back thousands of years, and we're going to trace the development of Maaseh Merkavah. But I wanted to do Arba Shenichnasu lePardes because in the Gemara, that's where it's placed. In other words, there's around 5 pages that deal with Maaseh Merkavah in the tractate of Chagiga. And we're going to go and we're going to learn some beautiful stories about Maaseh Merkavah and what the sages understood about Maaseh Merkavah. And then it goes into the story of Arba Shenichnasu lePardes, the four that went into paradise. And all of the commentaries say clearly that their entering into paradise was their experience of the workings of the chariot. That's why it's placed there in the Gemara. And so that's what we're going to pick up next week. The four that went into paradise. And we're going to understand what happened to them and the emphasis on paradox. And that's why it's so significant that this story is placed right along with Maaseh Merkavah, because as the story of the four that enter into paradise plays itself out, the essence of it is how each of the four dealt with the paradoxes that they encountered when they reached the pinnacle of their spiritual elevation in their meditation of Maaseh Merkavah. So hopefully everyone will join us, and if you can't, you'll make sure to watch the video.